Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And in that endless darkness, where every soul is tested, where corruption lurks in every shadow and betrayal hides behind every smile, there exists a question that has echoed through the Imperium for 10,000 years. What does it mean to be truly loyal? For most, loyalty is a word spoken in oaths, carved into monuments, shouted from the lips of the dying. But for one warrior, one space marine among countless billions, loyalty became something far more profound. It became the very essence of his being, tested not once but again and again, forged not in triumph, but in the crucible of suspicion, imprisonment, exile, and rebirth. His name is Titus, once captain of the Ultramarines' second company, condemned as a heretic, tortured for a century, erased from all records. And yet, through it all, he never wavered, never broke, never turned from the Emperor's light. This is the story of the most loyal Ultramarine in Warhammer 40,000. This is the story of a man who proved that true loyalty is not found in words or even deeds, but in the unbreakable will to serve, no matter the cost. The saga begins not on some grand battlefield or in the halls of power on Macragge, but on a simple agri-world called Titus, nestled within the realm of Ultramar. It was approximately 80 years before the battle for Macragge, before the first tyrannic war would shake the foundations of the Ultramarines chapter. On Titus, among endless fields and simple folk who lived and died in service to the Imperium's endless hunger, a child was born to a family of modest means. We do not know his birth name. History does not record the names of his parents or what dreams they might have held for their only son. What we do know is that this child's life was destined to be torn from its moorings before it ever truly began. Because on Titus, as on so many worlds, war came calling. The details of that conflict have been lost to time, buried beneath the weight of 10,000 other wars, 10,000 other worlds consumed by the galaxy's endless appetite for violence. But we know what it left behind. A battlefield, bodies strewn across scorched earth, the detritus of war scattered like seeds that would never grow. And in the midst of that carnage, a child. He was small, perhaps 7 or 8 years old by the standard reckoning of such things, though in truth, he might have been younger or older. War has a way of aging children, of stealing the softness from their faces and replacing it with something harder, something that knows too much too soon. This child walked through the killing fields alone, stepping over corpses with the practiced ease of someone who had seen death so many times it had lost its power to shock. In his hand, he carried an Astartes combat knife. Not a toy, not some memento scavenged from a dead soldier. A real weapon, as long as his forearm, its blade still stained with the evidence of its purpose. He held it like a sword, the grip meant for a giant's hand awkward in his small fingers, but his hold was sure. His eyes, set in a face smeared with dirt and blood that might or might not have been his own, were focused, determined. It was in this state that Sergeant Matorus of the Ultramarines found him. Matorus was a selector, one of those space marines tasked with the sacred duty of finding new recruits for the chapter, boys who might possess that rare combination of physical potential and mental fortitude necessary to survive the transformation into an Astartes. He had seen many such children over his long centuries of service, had evaluated thousands, had selected hundreds, had watched dozens of those selections fail, their bodies rejecting the gene seed or their minds breaking under the strain of becoming something more than human. But this child was different. Not in his appearance, which was unremarkable save for the context of his situation. Not in his size or strength, which were no greater than any other boy his age. What made him different was something Matorus could sense, something that manifested in the way the child moved. Yes, the way he held that oversized blade, the way his eyes scanned the battlefield with neither fear nor revulsion. Matorus would later describe what he saw in those eyes. He would say that he looked into the face of a child who had known pain, who had known rage, who had known loss and suffering, and all the dark gifts that war bestows upon the innocent. But in all that knowing, in all that pain and rage, there was one thing conspicuously absent: fear. The child had never known fear. This discovery troubled Matoris deeply. Fear, after all, serves a purpose. It keeps mortal creatures alive, warns them away from danger, teaches them the difference between courage and foolhardiness. The process of becoming a space marine doesn't eliminate fear so much as it teaches the Astartes to master it, to feel that primal warning and choose to act despite it. But a child who had never known fear, who possessed no instinctive understanding of that fundamental emotion, what would such a creature become? Matoris found himself wrestling with a question that would haunt him for the next 2 centuries. Was this child a blessing or a curse? Could a soul forged in such pain and rage, untouched by fear's tempering influence, be shaped into a weapon for the Emperor? Or would that same fearlessness become a liability, a crack in the foundation that would one day bring the whole structure tumbling down? In the end, Matoris made his choice. He approached the child, this small figure standing alone amid the dead, and offered him something that war had taken away: a purpose, a home, a chance to transform all that pain and rage into something that could serve the Imperium. He recommended the boy for recruitment into the Ultramarines chapter, hoping that the rigorous training and indoctrination could harness that fearless determination, could channel it into something noble rather than something terrible. The child accepted. How could he not? On Tarentus, amid the ashes of whatever life he had known before, there was nothing left for him but memories of pain. The Ultramarines offered him the only thing worth having in the Imperium of man. They offered him a war worth fighting. And so the boy who would become Demetrian Titus left Tarentus behind, never to return. He joined the ranks of the neophytes in the Ultramarines' 10th Company, where aspirants are tested and trained, where boys become scouts, and scouts become space marines. The training was brutal, as it had to be. The Ultramarines accept only the best, and the process of determining who is worthy claims the lives of many who would serve. But Titus excelled. Of course he did. That fearless determination that had troubled Matoris became the foundation of his success as a neophyte. Where other aspirants might hesitate, Titus charged forward. Where others might question or doubt, Titus executed his orders with absolute conviction. Every trial set before him, he met with the same unwavering resolve. Every challenge, no matter how daunting, he approached with the certainty that he would overcome it or die trying. This is not to say that Titus was perfect. Far from it. In his youth, he struggled with anger, that rage that Matoris had recognized in him as a child, finding expression in moments of combat. His temper would flare, threatening to override the discipline that the Ultramarines prized above almost all other qualities. This was a weakness, and his instructors worked tirelessly to help him master it, to teach him that rage without control was worse than useless, that it made a warrior predictable, exploitable. Slowly, painfully, Titus learned. He learned to feel the anger rising within him and to channel it, to use it as fuel rather than letting it use him. He learned that the Codex Astartes, that sacred tome written by Primarch Robut Guilliman himself, provided not just tactical doctrine, but moral guidance. And he learned something else, something that would define his approach to command in the years to come. But he learned that the Codex was meant to be understood, not merely obeyed, that its true power lay not in rigid adherence to every word, but in understanding the principles behind those words, the wisdom that informed them. This understanding would one day put him at odds with those who saw the Codex as an inflexible law rather than a guide. But in his youth, it simply meant that Titus became not just a warrior, but a thinking warrior, one who could adapt and improvise while remaining true to the spirit of Guilliman's teachings. After completing his training as a neophyte, after surviving the implantation of the gene seed and the transformative processes that turned his human body into something transhuman, Titus became a full battle brother of the Ultramarines. He had found his place in the world, or so he thought. He had found a purpose beyond mere survival, a brotherhood that demanded everything and gave everything in return. For the first time in his life, he had a home. But the galaxy had other plans. Roughly 50 years after Titus had joined the ranks of the Ultramarines' 10th Company, he earned his place among the battle brothers of the 2nd Company. This was no small achievement. The 2nd Company is a battle company, one of the 4 companies within the Ultramarines chapter tasked with the bulk of the chapter's combat operations. To serve in such a company meant that Titus had proven himself in countless engagements, had demonstrated not just skill, but reliability, not just courage, but competence. The 2nd Company at that time was commanded by Captain Severus Agaman, a warrior who would later rise to become the chapter's first captain, commander of the veteran 1st Company. Under Agaman's leadership, the 2nd Company had earned a reputation for excellence that was impressive even by the Ultramarines' exacting standards. They were disciplined, effective, and absolutely loyal to their Primarch's teachings. Titus served in this company with distinction, forming bonds with his battle brothers, earning decorations for valor and tactical acumen. He was, by all accounts, exactly what an Ultramarine should be. Humble despite his achievements, dedicated despite the hardships, unwavering despite the horrors he witnessed. If there was anything unusual about him, it was only that he possessed an unusual interest in studying the enemy. Most Space Marines learned their enemy's capabilities through briefings and after-action reports, through the accumulated wisdom of the chapter's archives and the strategic analysis of their superiors. Titus wanted something more direct. He wanted to understand not just what the enemy could do, but how they thought, what motivated them, what patterns guided their actions on the ground. To this end, he volunteered for close-quarters combat missions whenever possible, putting himself in situations where he would face the enemy not across a battlefield, but mere meters away, close enough to see their tactics unfold in real time. This approach was unconventional, but not unheard of. Some of the chapter's greatest warriors had developed similar methodologies, recognizing that true mastery of war required understanding the enemy's perspective. As Titus's superiors, including Captain Agaman, recognized the value of this approach and gave him opportunities to develop it further. They saw in him not just a warrior, but a student of war, someone who could contribute to the chapter's collective knowledge and perhaps one day lead others in battle. And then the Tyranids came. The year was 745 M41 in the old Imperial calendar, and the Ultramarines' homeworld of Macragge found itself in the path of Hive Fleet Behemoth, a massive Tyranid hive fleet that had emerged from the intergalactic void with one purpose: consumption. The battle for Macragge would become one of the defining moments in the Ultramarines' long history, a desperate struggle for survival that cost them nearly half their number, including the entirety of their 1st Company. But Titus was not there to witness it. The 2nd Company was fighting elsewhere when the Tyranids invaded, prosecuting some distant war that seemed important at the time, but would fade into insignificance compared to what was happening on Macragge. They tried to return, responding to the desperate astropathic calls for aid that struggled to pierce the shadow in the warp, that psychic deadening that accompanied the Tyranids wherever they went. They tried. But the galaxy is vast, and even with the ability to traverse the warp, traveling from one side of the Imperium to another takes time. Time that Macragge did not have. Time that the defenders fighting and dying on their homeworld could not afford to wait. By the time the 2nd Company finally reached Macragge, the battle was over. The chapter master, Marneus Calgar, still lived, though he had been so grievously wounded that they had to enter him within a dreadnought's armored shell for a time. First Captain Saul Invictus had fallen in glory, his name added to the long roll of heroes who had given everything for the Imperium. The 1st Company, those veterans who had stood as the chapter's finest warriors, had been annihilated to a man. But Macragge still stood, Against impossible odds, despite losses that would have broken lesser chapters, the Ultramarines had prevailed. They had proven that even the most terrible enemy, even a force of nature, given malevolent purpose, could be defeated if warriors were willing to pay the price. The Second Company had missed the greatest battle in their chapter's history. For warriors like Titus, who had spent their lives training for such moments, or who had dedicated themselves to the defense of Ultramar and the Imperium, this absence was a source of profound regret. They had not been there when their brothers needed them most. They had not stood beside Kalga in his darkest hour. They had not earned the honor of dying in defense of their homeworld. But there was still work to be done. Hive Fleet Behemoth might have been broken at Macragge, but fragments of it remained, scattered across Ultramar like seeds that would grow into new horrors if left unchecked. The Second Company, along with other Ultramarines forces and Imperial reinforcements from across the sector, was tasked with the unglamorous but essential work of scouring these remnants from Ultramar's worlds. It was during these operations that the chapter began to rebuild itself. With the First Company gone, S. Severus Agerman was promoted to First Captain, taking command of what would become a new generation of veterans. The Second Company needed a new leader, and that honor fell to Lucian Trajan, who had been serving as Agerman's first sergeant. Trajan was everything an Ultramarine should be. He was humble, recognizing that his new position came not from personal ambition, but from the chapter's need. He was competent, having learned his craft under one of the best commanders in the chapter, and he was loyal, not just to the chapter, but to the ideals that made the Ultramarines what they were. He was also wise enough to recognize talent when he saw it. One of Trajan's first decisions as captain was to promote Titus to sergeant and assign him to the captain's command squad. This was a position of great responsibility and great honor, placing Titus in close proximity to his commander, making him privy to the decision-making processes that guided the company in battle. But Trajan didn't stop there. He gave Titus a specific assignment that aligned perfectly with the young sergeant's interests and abilities. He tasked Titus with leading kill teams, small specialized units designed to strike at high-value targets and gather intelligence through direct engagement with the enemy. This was exactly the kind of close-quarters combat that Titus excelled at, the kind of warfare that would allow him to continue developing his understanding of how different Xenos species fought on the ground. Under Trajan's mentorship, Titus flourished. The captain recognized that his sergeant's unconventional approach to understanding the enemy wasn't a quirk to be discouraged, but a strength to be cultivated. Trajan himself had learned much from his own mentor, Severus Agerman, about the value of tactical flexibility and adaptive thinking. Now he passed those lessons on to Titus, while also learning from his sergeant's unique perspective. For nearly a century, this partnership endured. Trajan led the Second Company to countless victories, establishing a reputation for tactical excellence that rivaled even the achievements of his predecessor. Titus served at his side, growing in skill and wisdom, becoming not just a competent sergeant, but an exceptional one. The bond between them was strong, built on mutual respect and shared experiences, tempered in the fires of war. Yet they fought together against the enemies of mankind on dozens of worlds. They stood shoulder to shoulder against the green tide of the green-skin menace, those savage creatures that seemed to exist only to fight and kill. They faced the ancient and terrible Eldari, those Xenos whose cruelty was matched only by their arrogance. They even confronted the forces of chaos on occasion, those traitors who had turned from the Emperor's light and embraced damnation. Through all these battles, Titus continued to distinguish himself. He led kill teams with precision and daring, striking at enemy commanders and critical infrastructure with surgical effectiveness. He studied the tactics of every foe he faced, building a mental library of patterns and behaviors that made him increasingly effective at predicting enemy actions. His reputation within the Second Company and the chapter as a whole grew, marking him as a warrior of exceptional promise. And through it all, he remained humble. This was perhaps his greatest quality, the one that truly marked him as an ultramarine in the truest sense. Despite his achievements, despite the decorations and commendations he earned, Titus never sought advancement for its own sake. He was content to serve as a sergeant, to do his duty in whatever capacity the chapter required. The idea of seeking higher rank, of pushing for promotion or recognition, simply didn't occur to him. This humility was not weakness or false modesty. It was a genuine understanding that his service was not about personal glory, but about something far greater. Every battle he fought, every enemy he killed, every mission he completed was in service to the Emperor and the Imperium. The specific rank he held while doing that service was irrelevant. What mattered was the quality of that service, the dedication with which he fulfilled his duties. First Captain Agamemnon recognized this quality in Titus. He saw in the young sergeant the same selfless dedication that had made the Ultramarines great, the same willingness to put the chapter and the Imperium above personal ambition. Agamemnon took note of Titus, watching his development with approval, seeing in him the seeds of future leadership, even if Titus himself didn't see them. But fate, as always, had plans that no one could foresee. The campaign to Beta Arcturus should have been just another operation in the endless war that defined the Imperium's existence. The world had been invaded by forces from craftworld Biel-Tan, those Eldari warriors whose hatred for humanity burned with particular intensity, who saw the expansion of the Imperium as a cancer to be excised from the galaxy. The Ultramarines' second company, battle-hardened and efficient as always, deployed to drive them back. The battle followed familiar patterns at first. The Ultramarines' strike cruiser, Righteous Fury, engaged the Biel-Tan warships in orbit, while Captain Trajan led his company against the Xenos positions on the ground. Titus and the command squad were at Trajan's side, as they always were, fighting their way through aspect warriors, whose skill and speed made them formidable opponents even for Space Marines. The turning point came when Trajan confronted the Eldari Autarch, the commander of the enemy forces. Out in a display of martial skill that would have been worthy of legend, Trajan engaged the Xenos leader in single combat. The Autarch was fast, inhumanly so, wielding weapons that shimmered with eldritch energy. But Trajan was an ultramarine, trained in the finest traditions of warfare, guided by the wisdom of the Codex Astartes, and tempered by decades of combat experience. The duel was brief, but intense. Trajan's blade found its mark, and the Autarch fell, their alien blood staining the ground. It should have been a victory, the kind of decisive action that breaks an enemy's will and sends them fleeing. And indeed, the Biel-Tan forces began to withdraw, their carefully orchestrated invasion falling apart without their leader's guidance. But victory came with a price. As the Eldari retreated, Trajan received devastating news. As one of his Ultramarines had been captured, seized by the Xenos in the chaos of battle. The warrior's name was Leandros, a younger member of the company who would one day play a pivotal role in Titus's story, though no one could have known it then. Trajan made his decision immediately. No Ultramarine would be left in enemy hands if there was any possibility of retrieval. He gave command of the company to Titus, temporarily elevating his sergeant to lead in his place, and took a combat squad to pursue the retreating Eldari and recover their captured brother. It was a trap. Of course it was a trap. The Eldari are masters of deception, their strategies often layered with feints and misdirections that can baffle even the most brilliant human commanders. The capture of Leandros had been deliberate, a bait designed to lure out Trajan and separate him from the strength of his company. When the captain and his small force pursued, they walked directly into an ambush that the Eldari had prepared with meticulous care. The Xenos struck with overwhelming force, their weapons cutting through armor and flesh with terrible efficiency. Trajan fought as he had always fought, with courage and skill and absolute determination. But courage alone cannot overcome impossible odds. Skill alone cannot deflect every shot when the enemy has you surrounded and outnumbered. Captain Lucian Trajan fell on Beta Arcturus, far from Macragge, far from the homeworld he had dedicated his life to defending. He died as he had lived, in service to his chapter and his emperor. fighting to save one of his brothers from a fate worse than death. His last thoughts, and as his transhuman body finally succumbed to its wounds, were probably not of glory or fame, but of duty fulfilled and brothers saved. When Titus received word of Trajan's death, something inside him shattered. This was not the first time he had lost brothers in battle. He had served for decades, had seen good warriors die in every campaign, but this was different. Trajan had been more than just a commanding officer. He had been a mentor, a friend, someone who had helped shape Titus into the warrior he had become. The bond between them had been forged through shared hardship and mutual respect, strengthened by years of fighting side by side. But there was no time for grief. The battle was still raging. The Aeldari, though bloodied and leaderless, still posed a threat, and Titus was now in command of the Second Company, whether he felt ready for that responsibility or not. He led the company in an attack that drove the Xenos from Beta Arcturus entirely. The operation was executed with such precision and fury that it became a testament to both Trajan's training and Titus's own capabilities. The Ultramarines recovered both their captain's body and the brother he had died to save, denying the Aeldari even the satisfaction of claiming their remains. When the Second Company returned to Macragge, they bore Trajan's body with the honors befitting a fallen hero. The entire chapter mourned his loss, recognizing that they had lost not just a capable commander, but a warrior who embodied the best qualities of the Ultramarines. Trajan was interred in a grand sepulchre within the fortress of Hera, his name added to the long roll of honored dead, and his deeds remembered and celebrated. And then, Chapter Master Marneus Calga made a decision that would change the course of Titus's life forever. He offered Titus permanent command of the Second Company, elevating him from sergeant to captain in one momentous step. This was not an offer made lightly. The position of company captain carries immense responsibility within any Space Marine chapter, but particularly within the Ultramarines, where the legacy of Reboot Guilliman weighs heavily on every decision. A captain must be more than just a skilled warrior. They must be a tactician, a leader, a teacher, and an exemplar of the chapter's ideals. They must be able to make life and death decisions with calm deliberation, must be able to inspire their brothers to feats of heroism while also tempering their zeal with wisdom. And some within the Second Company had already recognized that Titus possessed these qualities. They had seen him lead with both courage and intelligence during the Beta Arcturus campaign. They had witnessed his tactical acumen in countless battles before that. They knew that he had the respect of his fellow battle brothers, that they would follow him not just out of duty, but out of genuine trust in his abilities. But Titus himself had never sought this elevation. The idea of becoming a captain had simply never been part of his plans. He had been content as a sergeant, content to serve Trajan and the Emperor in whatever capacity was required. The prospect of stepping into Trajan's role, of taking on the mantle of leadership that his mentor had worn so well, filled him with something he rarely experienced. Not fear, never fear, but a deep sense of responsibility, a weight that settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. Could he be the captain that the Second Company needed? Could he live up to the standard set by Trajan and Agamemnon before him? Could he guide his brothers through the wars that lay ahead without failing them the way he felt he had failed to protect Trajan? These questions haunted him as he accepted Calga's offer, because of course he accepted. When your chapter master offers you a position of leadership, when your brothers need a captain and you have been deemed worthy of that role, you don't refuse out of personal doubt or false humility. You accept, and you do your absolute best to be worthy of the trust that has been placed in you. And so, Dmitri and Titus became captain of the Ultramarines' Second Company. Yet he took up the mantle that Trajan had left behind, along with all the responsibilities and burdens that came with it. He assumed command of roughly 100 Space Marines, warriors whose lives would now depend on his decisions, whose victories and defeats would be measured against his leadership. The weight of this responsibility never truly left him. Even as he led the Second Company to victory after victory over the years that followed, even as he earned the respect and admiration of his brothers and the approval of the chapter's leadership, Titus carried with him the memory of Trajan's death and the determination not to fail those under his command, the way he felt he had failed his mentor. First, Captain Severus Agamemnon watched Titus's development as a captain with approval. Yet he saw in the younger warrior the same qualities that had made Trajan great, combined with a tactical creativity that was distinctly Titus's own. Agamemnon made his approval known, both to Titus directly and to the chapter's other commanders, marking the new captain as a warrior to watch, someone who might one day rise to even greater heights of leadership. Chapter Master Calgar himself regarded Titus as an exemplary warrior and strategist, the very model of the humility expected of an Ultramarine. Here was a warrior who could have let his achievements inflate his ego, who could have sought glory and recognition for their own sake. Instead, Titus remained focused on his duty, on leading his company with skill and wisdom, on fulfilling the trust that had been placed in him. For 10 years, Titus led the second company across the battlefields of the Imperium. He fought greenskin menace on a dozen worlds, drove back Chaos Raiders who thought to prey on Imperial citizens, faced down Xenos threats that would have overwhelmed lesser forces. The second company, always among the finest in the chapter, became even more formidable under his leadership. And through it all, 2 warriors stood at his side, as constant as the stars themselves. Sergeant Sidonus, who had become an Astartes a few decades before Titus, served as his second-in-command and closest confidant. Where Titus could be intense and focused, Sidonus brought a steadying presence, a been there, done that, no problem attitude that helped diffuse tense situations and keep the company's morale high. The relationship that had started as a rookie-veteran dynamic had evolved into a deep friendship, a brotherhood that went beyond mere camaraderie. And there was Leandros.
I've been covering Warhammer lore for quite a while, and Titus's story hits different. Most Space Marine stories are about glory, about victory against impossible odds, but Titus, his story is about enduring when there's no glory to be had, about staying loyal when everyone doubts you. That's harder than any battle. It makes you wonder, would we have that kind of strength to serve without recognition, to forgive betrayal, keep going when the whole galaxy seems against you? I don't know if I could, but that's what makes his story so compelling. But anyway, let's continue.
The same young warrior that Trajan had died to save from the Aeldari now served in Titus's command squad. Where Sidonus was experienced and pragmatic, Leandros was zealous and idealistic, a believer in the letter of the Codex Astartes, rather than just its spirit. He looked up to Titus with a mixture of admiration and something else, something that might have been wariness, though few recognized it at the time. Together, these 3 would face a trial that none of them could have anticipated, a trial that would shatter their brotherhood, test Titus's loyalty to its absolute limits, and set in motion a chain of events that would span more than a century. Yet the call came in the year 855 M41, though the exact date would later be disputed and obscured by the fog of war and the passage of time. The Forge world of Graia was under attack, and the situation was desperate. This alone was not unusual. Forge worlds were constantly under threat from enemies who coveted their technology and productive capacity. What made Graia's situation critical was the nature of the threat and the strategic importance of what they were producing. Graia was home to massive manufactorums dedicated to producing titans, those god machines of war that towered over battlefields and could turn the tide of entire campaigns. The loss of even one such facility would be a blow to the Imperium's war effort. The loss of Graia, with its multiple Titan production centers, would be catastrophic. The enemy was a massive greenskin horde, led by a particularly brutal and cunning war boss named Grimskull. The Greenskins, those savage Xenos who lived only for war and violence, had descended upon Graia in numbers that overwhelmed the planet's considerable defenses. The Astra Militarum forces present, including the 203rd Cadian Regiment, were fighting valiantly, but being slowly ground down by the sheer weight of numbers and the ferocity of the greenskin assault. The Ultramarines' second company was dispatched to Graia to stem the tide and save the Forge World before it fell. It was the kind of mission that Captain Titus had prepared for his entire life. A desperate defense, overwhelming odds, the fate of an Imperial world hanging in the balance. Everything that the Ultramarines stood for, everything they had trained for, would be put to the test. Titus led a strike force that included Sergeants Sidonus and Leandros, deploying via Thunderhawk gunship to the planet's surface. What they found was a war zone of staggering proportions. The greenskins were everywhere, their crude but effective war machines tearing through Imperial defenses, their warriors surging forward in waves that seemed endless. One of the first people Titus met on Graia was 2nd Lieutenant Mira of the 203rd Cadian Regiment, the last surviving officer of her unit after the greenskin assault had decimated their command structure. Despite the losses her regiment had suffered, despite the desperate circumstances they found themselves in, Mira maintained her composure and her determination. She was precisely the kind of officer that the Astra Militarum prided itself on producing. Competent, brave, and absolutely unwilling to give up, even when the situation seemed hopeless. Titus recognized these qualities immediately. Where some Space Marines might have dismissed the concerns of regular human soldiers, treating them as little more than cannon fodder to be directed as needed, Titus worked with Mira as a valued ally. This was partly his tactical acumen, recognizing that coordinated efforts between Astartes and Militarum forces multiplied their effectiveness. But it was also simply who he was, someone who respected courage and competence regardless of the source. Together they began the work of pushing back the greenskin tide. Titus led his small force through the manufactorums and defense installations of Graia, securing critical positions, eliminating greenskin warlords, and working to contain the invasion before it could spread to the planet's most vital facilities. The fighting was brutal, even by the standards of warfare in the 41st millennium. Greenskins, for all their crude technology and barbaric ways, were formidable opponents. They were physically powerful, naturally resilient, and absolutely fearless in battle. Moreover, they were led by war boss Grimskull, who possessed a cunning that belied the greenskin reputation for simple-minded aggression. But the Ultramarines were the finest warriors humanity had to offer, and Titus was proving himself to be an exceptional leader even among their ranks. He analyzed the greenskin patterns of attack, identified their weaknesses, and exploited them with surgical precision. He personally led assaults on key enemy positions, or his bolt pistol and chainsword speaking the Emperor's wrath as he carved through the enemy ranks. One of their crucial objectives was securing a Titan manufactorum, preventing the greenskins from either destroying it or, worse, getting their hands on the war machines stored within. The thought of greenskins piloting an Imperial Titan was almost too horrible to contemplate, not just for the tactical implications, but for the sheer blasphemy of it. The assault on the manufactorum showcased everything that made Titus an effective commander. He coordinated his small force with precision, using the environment to their advantage, striking at the enemy where they were weakest while avoiding direct confrontation where the greenskins held numerical superiority. When direct confrontation was unavoidable, he led from the front, his mere presence inspiring his brothers to feats of heroism. They secured the manufactorum. They pushed back the greenskin forces threatening it. For a moment, it seemed like the tide was beginning to turn in the Imperium's favor, but then something happened that changed everything. An inquisitor named Drogon contacted Titus with a request for assistance. This was not unusual in itself. The Inquisition often worked alongside Space Marine chapters, particularly when facing threats that required specialized knowledge or equipment. What made this request significant was its nature. Drogon spoke of a weapon, an experimental device called the Psychic Scourge, powered by a sophisticated energy source that could, theoretically, be used to devastating effect against the greenskin invaders. But this power source was located in a facility that had been overrun, and Drogon needed the Ultramarines' help to retrieve it before the greenskins could destroy it or turn it to their own purposes. Titus agreed to the mission. How could he not? If this weapon could turn the tide of battle, could save Graia and the thousands of Imperial citizens and soldiers fighting for their lives, then retrieving it was worth the risk. He took Sidonus and Leandros with him, leaving the main bulk of his forces to continue the broader campaign while his command squad pursued this critical objective. What happened next would become the source of suspicion and accusation that would follow Titus for the next century and beyond. As they fought their way to the power source, as they secured it and prepared to transport it to Drogon's location, Titus was exposed directly to its energies. This should have killed him. Or worse, the power source operated on principles that touched the warp, that terrible realm of chaos that underlies reality like a cancer eating away at the foundations of the universe. Direct exposure to warp energy is universally fatal to unprotected humans, and even space marines, with all their genetic enhancements and mental conditioning, are not immune to its corruptive influence. The energy should have burned through Titus's armor, should have seared his flesh, should have driven him mad or killed him outright. Instead, he survived, completely unharmed, as if the warp energies that should have destroyed him had simply washed over him like water over stone, leaving no mark, no corruption, no taint. This was the first sign that something was different about Titus, something that neither he nor anyone else fully understood. It should have been seen as miraculous, as evidence of the Emperor's protection, or some unique blessing that marked Titus as special. And perhaps some did see it that way. But others, particularly Leandros, began to wonder. Because in the Imperium of man, there is a saying that has guided the Inquisition for 10,000 years. Innocence proves nothing. And one of the few certainties in a galaxy filled with horrors is that nobody survives direct exposure to the warp without being touched by it. Nobody. Except, apparently, Dimitri and Titus. They delivered the power source to Drogon, and the Inquisitor assured them that it would be put to good use against the greenskin invaders. But even as they continued their campaign across Graia, even as they fought to drive back Grimskull's forces, something else was happening. Something far more terrible than a simple greenskin invasion. Because Inquisitor Drogon was not who he appeared to be. The real Drogon had been dead for some time, his body possessed and used as a puppet by a demon, a creature of the warp serving a far more sinister master. And that master was about to reveal himself. His name was Nemeroth, and he was a chaos sorcerer of terrible power, a servant of the ruinous powers who sought nothing less than ascension to demonhood. The entire greenskin invasion had been part of his plan, an elaborate distraction designed to occupy the Imperium's forces while he prepared to use the power source for his own ends. When the Ultramarines discovered the deception, and when they realized that they had been manipulated into helping a servant of chaos, the nature of the war on Graia changed entirely. This was no longer just a battle to save a Forge world from greenskin raiders. It was a fight against chaos itself, against forces that sought not just to conquer, but to corrupt, to twist the very fabric of reality into something obscene and wrong. Nemeroth opened a rift to the warp, a tear in reality through which poured demons and traitors in numbers that dwarfed even the greenskin horde. The sky above Graia turned a sickly, unnatural color. The air itself seemed to scream with the presence of things that should not exist, and through it all, Nemeroth worked to complete his ascension, to transform himself into a demon prince through a ritual powered by the very energy source that Titus had helped him acquire. The Ultramarines had no choice but to throw everything they had at stopping this. The consequences of a new demon prince being born on an Imperial Forge world, with access to the technology and knowledge contained there, were simply too terrible to contemplate. They fought through hordes of demons and cultists, through traitor Astartes, who had once sworn the same oaths as Titus now swore, through nightmares made flesh. And it was during this desperate fight that something happened that would prove even more significant than Titus's earlier survival of warp exposure. As he fought his way toward Nemeroth's location, as he was repeatedly exposed to the energies of the warp that poured through the rift, Titus once again showed an immunity that should have been impossible. Demons struck at him with powers that had broken the minds of stronger warriors. The energies of the warp washed over him in waves that should have reduced him to a gibbering wreck or corrupted him into serving the very forces he fought against. But again and again, Titus emerged unscathed, his mind clear, his purpose unwavering. Sidonus saw this and marveled at it, interpreting it as evidence of Titus's exceptional faith and purity of purpose. But Leandros saw it, and his suspicions, already kindled by the earlier incident, burst into full flame. Because this should not be possible. This could not be possible. Unless there was something fundamentally different about Titus, something that set him apart from every other Space Marine in the Imperium. And in the Imperium of man, being different was not a blessing. It was a curse. It was grounds for suspicion and investigation, and quite possibly execution as a heretic. But there was no time to address these concerns, no time for debate or interrogation. The battle reached its climax as Titus confronted Nemeroth directly, the Chaos Sorcerer on the very brink of his transformation into something far more terrible. Sergeant Sidonus fell in this final battle, cut down by Nemeroth's power, dying as he had lived in service to the Emperor and his brothers. The loss of Sidonus, Titus's closest friend and confidant, might have broken a lesser warrior. Instead, it fueled his determination. He threw himself at Nemeroth with a fury that bordered on recklessness, engaging the sorcerer in single combat, even as the transformation threatened to complete itself. What followed was a battle that defied easy description. Titus, a mere space marine, however skilled and determined, fighting against a being that was halfway between mortal and demon, wielding powers that could reshape reality itself. It should have been a slaughter. It should have been over in seconds. Instead, Titus prevailed. Through a combination of skill, determination, and that same mysterious immunity to the warp that had protected him throughout the campaign, he struck down Nemeroth before the transformation could complete. The Chaos Sorcerer's body fell, his dark soul dragged back into the warp to face the punishment of his gods for failing them. The rift began to close, the demonic invasion faltering without the will that had sustained it. Graia was saved. The manufactorums were secured. The Imperium had won, at terrible cost, but won nonetheless. Captain Demetrian Titus stood victorious over the forces of chaos, having achieved what should have been impossible. He should have been celebrated as a hero. He should have been honored for his achievement, for saving an entire Forge world and countless lives. And for a brief moment, it seemed like that might happen. Then the Inquisition arrived, and everything changed. Inquisitor Thrax descended upon Graia with an escort of Black Templar's Space Marines, those zealots who served the Inquisition with absolute dedication. He came not to congratulate Titus on his victory, but to investigate him for heresy, because Brother Leandros, that young warrior who had fought beside Titus throughout the campaign, who had witnessed his captain's impossible survival, had done something that would haunt both of them for the rest of their lives. He had reported Titus to the Inquisition. The reasoning behind this action, from Leandros's perspective, was sound. The Codex Astartes, that holy text that guided every Ultramarine's actions, made it clear that exposure to the warp corrupted. That survival of such exposure without visible taint was not a miracle, but evidence of something far more sinister. In Leandros's mind, shaped by years of indoctrination and a literal interpretation of the Codex's teachings, there could be only one explanation for Titus's immunity. Titus must already be corrupted. He must be in league with the ruinous powers, perhaps unknowingly, perhaps as part of some scheme so subtle that even he didn't recognize his own damnation. And if that were true, then allowing him to remain in command of a company of Space Marines represented an existential threat, not just to the Ultramarines, but to the Imperium itself. So Leandros had contacted the Reclusium, the chaplaincy of the Ultramarines, and through them the Inquisition had been alerted. And now Inquisitor Thrax stood before Titus. this warrior who had just saved an entire world, and accused him of the most terrible crime imaginable. Heresy. Titus could have fought this accusation. He was a space marine, a captain of the Ultramarines, standing on a world he had just saved from damnation. The warriors under his command were loyal to him, would have followed him against anyone who threatened him. He could have resisted. He could have demanded a proper investigation within his chapter, rather than submitting to the Inquisition's authority. But he didn't, because to resist would have been to bring suspicion down not just on himself, but on his entire chapter. It would have created a crisis that could have torn the Ultramarines apart, set brother against brother, created exactly the kind of division that the forces of chaos sought to exploit. So instead, Titus made a choice that demonstrated the depth of his loyalty more powerfully than any battlefield victory could. He surrendered, willingly, without resistance or protest. He allowed the Black Templars to take him into custody, allowed Inquisitor Thrax to place him in chains, allowed himself to be removed from Graia and from the Second Company he had led with such dedication. His last words to Leandros, and as the young warrior watched his captain being led away, were not of anger or betrayal, but of profound disappointment. Titus explained that the Codex Astartes was meant to be a guide, a source of wisdom, not an inflexible law to be followed without thought or understanding. That how a warrior conducted himself within those guidelines was what truly mattered, not blind adherence to the letter of the text. It was a test, Titus said, that Leandros had failed. But Leandros believed he had passed the only test that mattered. He had put the security of the Imperium above personal loyalty, above friendship, above everything. He had done what he believed was right, what the Codex demanded, even though it cost him everything. Neither of them knew in that moment that their paths would cross again more than a century later, and neither could have imagined the circumstances that would bring them together once more. Because in that moment, as Titus was led away to face the Inquisition's judgment, it seemed like his story had reached its end. It had not. In many ways, it had only just begun. Chapter. Master Marneus Calgar learned of Titus's detention and immediately began making inquiries. The loss of one of his best captains, taken by the Inquisition on charges of heresy, was not something Calgar could simply accept without investigation. He submitted formal requests for information, for access to Titus, for updates on the investigation and its findings. He received no response. Every message went unanswered. Every inquiry was met with silence. It was as if Titus had simply vanished from existence, swallowed up by the vast machinery of the Inquisition and lost somewhere in its depths. What Calgar didn't know, what no one except Inquisitor Thrax and a handful of his most trusted servants knew, was that Titus had not simply been taken for investigation. He had been taken to a remote watch station, one of countless such facilities scattered across the Imperium, where the Inquisition conducted its most sensitive operations. And there, in the depths of that station, Titus began a new kind of ordeal, one that would last for a full century. Inquisitor Jerome Thrax was a man driven by conviction and consumed by suspicion. He had served the Ordo Malleus, the branch of the Inquisition dedicated to hunting demons and the forces of chaos, for over 4 centuries. In that time, he had seen countless examples of corruption, or witnessed the terrible ways that even the most loyal servants could be turned against everything they had sworn to protect. But Thrax had developed a particular obsession that went beyond his mandate as a demon hunter. He had come to believe that the Space Marines themselves represented one of the greatest threats to the Imperium's survival. These superhuman warriors, genetically enhanced and given immense power, could turn that power against the very people they were meant to protect if they were corrupted. And history had proven his point. The Horus Heresy, that galaxy-spanning civil war that had nearly destroyed the Imperium at its founding, had been led by Space Marines. Legions of the Emperor's finest had turned to chaos, becoming the very thing they had been created to fight. In Thrax's mind, eternal vigilance was not just prudent, it was absolutely necessary. and so he had made it his mission to monitor Space Marine chapters, particularly those operating in the segmentums Solar and Tempestus. He watched for any sign of corruption, any hint that a chapter or individual Marine might be wavering in their loyalty. And when he found such signs, he acted without mercy or hesitation. Titus, with his impossible immunity to the warp, represented exactly the kind of anomaly that Thrax's paranoia seized upon. Here was a space marine who should have been corrupted, but showed no signs of it. Either he possessed some unique resistance that made him invaluable as a weapon against chaos, or that very resistance was evidence of deeper corruption, of a taint so subtle and pervasive that conventional methods couldn't detect it. Thrax intended to determine which was true, and he didn't care how long it took, or what methods were necessary to find the answer. For 100 years, Titus endured what followed. The tests, the interrogations, the psychic probes that tore through his mind searching for any hint of corruption. The torture, both physical and psychological, designed to break down whatever defenses might be hiding his true nature. Again and again, the same conclusion emerged. There was no taint, no corruption, no sign that Titus had been touched by chaos in any way. His mind was clear, his soul pure, his loyalty to the Emperor absolute and unshakable. But Thrax couldn't accept this. In his 4 centuries of service, he had learned to trust nothing and suspect everything. The fact that every test showed Titus to be pure simply meant that the corruption was hidden deeper than his methods could detect. It meant he needed to look harder, to probe deeper, to apply more pressure until the truth finally revealed itself. Between these sessions of interrogation and testing, Titus was placed in a stasis cell, his body and mind frozen in time, preserved like a specimen in some vast collection. He would wake, endure hours or days of examination and torture, and then be returned to stasis until Thrax decided it was time for the next round. Other Space Marines shared his fate. Thrax had collected them over the years, warriors from various chapters, whose actions or circumstances had drawn his suspicion. They too underwent the same endless cycle of testing and stasis. Prisoners of an inquisitor whose zeal had crossed the line into something darker. But where others might have broken under this treatment, where the endless torture and isolation might have driven them to madness or despair, Titus endured. He had faced death countless times on the battlefield and never flinched. He had watched brothers die and carried on. He had been betrayed by one he had fought alongside and still maintained his loyalty to the Emperor and the Imperium. This was just another trial, another test, and like all the others, he would face it with the same unwavering determination that had defined his entire life. He thought often of Trajan, during those periods of consciousness between the stasis and the testing, of how his mentor had died protecting a brother who had ultimately betrayed Titus, of how Trajan would have handled this situation, what wisdom he might have offered to sustain someone facing a century of imprisonment and torture. He thought of Sidonus, his friend who had fallen on Graia, who had believed in Titus until the very end, who had never doubted, never questioned, never wavered in his loyalty to his captain and brother. And yes, he thought of Leandros, the young warrior who had reported him, who had set this entire nightmare in motion. Titus didn't hate him for it. Hate required a level of personal investment that seemed petty in the face of what he was enduring. But he was disappointed, because Leandros had failed to understand the most important lesson that Titus could have taught him. That loyalty meant trusting your brothers even when you didn't understand everything. And that faith sometimes meant accepting mysteries rather than demanding answers. That the Codex Astartes was a guide to help warriors make the right decisions, not a replacement for making those decisions themselves. But there was no one to teach these lessons to now. No company to command, no brothers to lead, no battles to fight, except the internal one to maintain his sanity and his sense of self through the endless cycle of torture and stasis. The years passed, decades, a full century. Outside the walls of Thrax's watch station, the galaxy continued its endless wars. The Imperium endured, as it always had, through the sacrifice and dedication of countless billions. The Ultramarines fought on without their lost captain. his name removed from the chapter's records not out of shame, but out of a different kind of agony, the shame of having failed to protect one of their own. Marnus Calgar never stopped trying to get answers about Titus's fate. Every year, sometimes more frequently, he submitted requests for information, for access, for anything that would tell him what had happened to the captain he had entrusted with the second company. Every request went unanswered. And then, after a century of this, everything changed. Inquisitor Thrax's obsession with monitoring and testing space marines had made him powerful enemies within the Inquisition itself. Many of his fellow Inquisitors found his methods extreme even by their standards, his paranoia excessive. But as long as he confined his activities to his watch station and the marines he had already captured, they tolerated his excesses as the eccentricity of a veteran demon hunter. Then, Thrax made a fatal mistake. During an investigation into a Space Marine chapter called the Grey Slayers, whom he suspected of corruption, Thrax led a Grey Knight strike force in an assault that purged the entire chapter. Every brother, every aspirant, every serf in their service was put to the sword, based on Thrax's certainty that they had fallen to chaos. During that purge, as Thrax searched for the source of the Grey Slayers' supposed corruption, he found it, but not in the way he expected. The source of corruption was within him. A demon, one of those terrible entities of the warp, had managed to possess him, had been working through him for who knows how long, turning his paranoia and suspicion into weapons that served chaos rather than the Imperium. The Grey Knights, those specialized space marines whose sole purpose was hunting demons, recognized the possession immediately, and they did what had to be done. Inquisitor Jerome Thrax, 4th-century veteran of the Ordo Malleus, died at the hands of the very warriors he had led against the Grey Slayers, his body destroyed and his corrupted soul cast back into the warp. In the aftermath, an inquisitorial conclave was convened to investigate how such a senior inquisitor could have been possessed without anyone noticing. They seized his holdings, including his remote watch station, sending in teams to document everything and ensure that no other traces of corruption remained. That's when they found Titus and the other imprisoned space marines. The discovery created a scandal within the Inquisition that was carefully suppressed. While here was evidence that one of their own had been conducting unauthorized detention and torture of space marines for decades, possibly while under the influence of a demon. The implications were staggering. How many of Thrax's investigations had been legitimate? How many warriors had he destroyed or imprisoned based on suspicions planted by the very forces he thought he was fighting? The Inquisitor overseeing the investigation faced a choice. She could try to cover up Thrax's crimes, could quietly dispose of the imprisoned Marines and pretend none of this had ever happened. Or she could do the right thing, even though it would expose the Inquisition to criticism and potentially undermine trust between the Inquisition and the Adeptus Astartes. She chose the latter. But the imprisoned Space Marines were released and sent to the Deathwatch Watch Fortress at Watcher Keep for evaluation, to determine if any of them had actually been corrupted during their imprisonment, or if Thrax's suspicions had been unfounded. For Titus, freedom came like a shock. After a century of being a prisoner, of existing only to endure testing and torture and the void of stasis, the prospect of actually being free felt almost unreal. When he finally stood in front of the evaluators at Watcher Keep, when they ran their tests and examined his mind and soul for any trace of taint, he almost expected them to find something, to validate Thrax's suspicions and send him back into imprisonment. But they found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Every test, yes, every examination confirmed what Thrax's own testing had shown. Titus was pure, uncorrupted, loyal to the core of his being. He was free to go, free to return to the Ultramarines, to reclaim his place in the chapter that had been his home for so long. Except he couldn't do it. During his century of imprisonment, Titus had received no word from the Ultramarines, no messages of support, no visits, no indication that anyone was still looking for him. He didn't know, couldn't have known, that Thrax had suppressed all of Calgar's inquiries, that the chapter had never stopped trying to find him. All Titus knew was that he had been taken away and seemingly forgotten, and in his mind, there could be only one explanation. His actions on Graia, his survival of the warp exposure, must have brought shame to the chapter. They must have decided that he was too great a risk, too much of a liability to be allowed back. This belief, born of ignorance rather than fact, settled over Titus like a shroud. He had failed his chapter. He had brought dishonor to the name Ultramarine through his very existence. How could he go back now? How could he face warriors who must surely see him as tainted, as damaged, even if the Inquisition's tests had cleared him? So when the Death Watch offered him a place in their ranks, Titus accepted. And he did so as a Black Shield, one of those rare Space Marines who erase all traces of their chapter affiliation, who serve without identity or history, who dedicate themselves to fighting Xenos threats as a form of penance for whatever drove them to this extremity. He removed all insignia from his armor, was all markers that would identify him as an Ultramarine. He took a new name, or rather, a lack of name, Nullus, nothing, no one. A warrior without a past, serving out what he expected would be the last years of his life, fighting the Imperium's enemies in the shadows. The Death Watch welcomed him, as they welcomed all Black Shields. They didn't ask questions about his past, or why he had chosen this path. They simply accepted that here was a warrior willing to dedicate himself to their mission, willing to fight and die in service to the Imperium without asking for recognition or reward. And fight he did. Titus, now Nullus, threw himself into his new role with the same dedication he had shown as a captain. He served in kill teams, small specialized units that deployed against the most dangerous Xenos threats. And he fought Tyranids in the dark corridors of space hulks. He battled Aeldari raiders who thought themselves too quick and clever to be caught by mere humans. He faced down Necron warriors who had slumbered since before humanity had developed writing. Through all of this, he maintained the same tactical acumen that had made him an effective captain. His fellow Death Watch warriors noticed this, recognized that Nullus possessed experience and skill beyond what most Black Shields demonstrated. But they respected his privacy, his choice to remain unnamed and unaffiliated. Years passed. Decades. Titus served in the Death Watch longer than some warriors served in their home chapters. He became a fixture at Watcher Keep, one of those Black Shields who seemed destined to serve until death finally claimed him on some distant battlefield. And then the Fourth Tyrannic War began. The Tyranids, those extragalactic horrors that consumed all life in their path, emerged in force in the Segmentum Pacificus. Hive Fleet Leviathan, a massive tendril of the hive mind, had found a way to attack from beneath the galactic plane, emerging in a region that had limited experience with the Tyranid threat. The response was immediate but chaotic. Imperial forces scrambled to meet this new threat, but many commanders had no idea what they were facing. The Tyranids were unlike any other enemy. They adapted, evolved, overwhelmed through sheer numbers and biological innovation. Fighting them required specialized knowledge and tactics that many commanders simply didn't possess. The Death Watch, with their experience fighting Xenos of all kinds, were among the first to deploy. Kill teams scattered across the war zone, supporting Imperial forces, providing expertise, and undertaking missions too dangerous or specialized for regular troops. Nullus was assigned to Kill Team Caesaren, a squad of experienced warriors drawn from various chapters. Their mission was to deploy to the Residius system, where an Imperial Guard regiment was attempting to hold back a Tyranid splinter fleet with limited success. The kill team would provide support, gather intelligence, and conduct precision strikes against critical Tyranid organisms. The deployment began normally enough. The Corvus Blackstar transport, carrying Kill Team Caesaren, entered the atmosphere of Kadaku, the system's primary world, preparing to join the fight on the surface. But before they could land, the sky around them filled with flying Tyranid organisms, winged horrors that swarmed the aircraft like locusts. The pilot fought to maintain control as the creatures tore at the Black Star's hull, ripping through armor plating and severing control systems. The transport began to fall, tumbling toward the surface in an uncontrolled descent that promised death for everyone aboard. The crash was violent beyond description. Metal shrieked as it was torn apart. The impact drove the Black Star deep into the ground, the force of it crushing equipment and throwing warriors against bulkheads with enough force to crack even their enhanced bones. When the wreckage finally settled, when the screaming of tortured metal finally stopped, Kill Team Kasaran was gone. Every warrior except one had been killed in the crash or in the desperate fighting immediately after, as tyrannid organisms swarmed over the downed transport. Nullus survived. Somehow, impossibly, he survived the crash and the initial swarm, but his survival was short-lived. As he fought to extract himself from the wreckage, as he tried to assess the situation and determine his next move, a Carnifex emerged from the tyrannid swarm. The Carnifex is one of the most terrible creatures in the tyrannid arsenal. Standing several meters tall, armored with chitin plates that can shrug off weapons fire, armed with massive claws and bioweapons, it is a living tank designed to smash through fortifications and tear apart vehicles. Against a single Space Marine, even one as skilled as Titus, it was nearly unstoppable. The battle was brief. Titus fought with all the skill and determination he possessed, but he was already wounded from the crash. His armor breached in multiple places, his weapons nearly exhausted. The Carnifex's claws found him, tearing through his armor, crushing his transhuman body with sickening ease. As Titus fell, as his genetically enhanced healing tried and failed to cope with the catastrophic damage, he felt something that he had not felt in over a century of service. Not fear, never fear, but something close to it. A recognition that this was the end, that after all the battles and trials and endless years of service, he was finally going to die on some nameless world, alone, forgotten, with no one to remember that he had even been here. It should have been the end. By all rights, it should have been. But the Emperor, or fate, or simple chance, had other plans. Because at the very moment that Titus lay dying on Kadaku, a ship broke from the warp at the edge of the Residius system. The Righteous Fury, that strike cruiser that had carried him to so many battles during his time as captain, had returned. And aboard it were warriors who had not forgotten him. Chief Librarian Varro Tigurius was one of the most powerful psychers in the Imperium, a wielder of psychic powers that could level buildings and read the future in the currents of the warp. As the Righteous Fury traversed the warp toward Residius, Tigurius had been using his abilities to scan ahead, to assess the situation they would be entering. And in doing so, he sensed something unexpected, a soul signature that he recognized, that he had not felt in over a century. The psychic impression of a warrior he had known, had fought alongside, and had respected as one of the finest commanders the chapter had produced. Even as the shadow in the warp, that psychic deadening that accompanied the Tyrannids, began to cloud his vision, Tigurius recognized Dimitri and Titus. Not Nullus, not some nameless black shield, but the captain who had once led the second company with such distinction. Tigurius immediately alerted First Captain Severus Agemon, who commanded the strike force aboard the Righteous Fury. Agemon had served alongside Titus decades ago, had been one of those who recognized his potential when he was just a sergeant. The news that Titus was alive, that he was here on Kadaku, that he could be recovered, spurred Agemon to immediate action. The Ultramarines deployed in force, their Thunderhawk gunships screaming down through the atmosphere toward the coordinates Tigurius provided. They arrived to find the surface of Kadaku crawling with tyrannid organisms, the Imperial defenders overwhelmed and falling back in desperate fighting withdrawal. They were too late to save Kadaku itself. The planet was lost, its people consumed, its defenses shattered. But they arrived in time to allow the surviving Deathwatch warriors to evacuate, to extract them from the disaster and save them to fight another day. And they arrived in time to save Titus. First Captain Agamemnon personally led the team that recovered him. that pulled his broken body from the killing ground and brought him aboard the righteous Fury. The apothecaries took one look at his wounds and delivered their assessment. He was dying. The damage was too extensive, his body too far gone. Without immediate and drastic intervention, Dimitri and Titus would be dead within the hour. But they had one option: the Rubicon Primaris. That dangerous procedure that could transform a standard space marine into a Primaris marine. Bigger, stronger, more resilient, but at tremendous risk. The procedure killed more warriors than it saved, pushing already damaged bodies beyond their limits in the process of transformation. The decision was made immediately. Titus had not been saved after a century of absence just to die now. He would undergo the Rubicon Primaris, would be transformed into a Primaris Marine, or die in the attempt. The procedure, which the Ultramarines called the Calgarian Rites, began immediately. Titus was barely conscious. His body held together more by will than flesh. The apothecaries worked with desperate speed, implanting the new organs, introducing the enhanced gene seed, pushing his failing body through changes that would have killed most healthy warriors. Titus endured it, as he had endured everything else, with silence, with determination, with the same unbreakable will that had sustained him through torture and isolation and a century of believing he had been abandoned. He survived. Against the odds, against the statistics that said he should have died, Dimitri and Titus underwent the Rubicon Primaris successfully. His body was transformed, made larger and stronger, his already formidable capabilities enhanced to new heights. When he finally woke in the recovery bay, it was as a Primaris Space Marine, reborn and remade. And the first face he saw was that of Chief Librarian Tigurius, who had searched for his soul across the void and found him when he needed it most. Tigurius performed one final examination, using his psychic abilities to peer into Titus's mind and soul, searching for any trace of corruption or taint that might have been missed by the earlier examinations. What he found was the same thing every other examination had shown: purity, loyalty, an unshakable dedication to the Emperor and the Imperium. Satisfied, Tigurius departed to inform Chapter Master Calgar, and Titus was left to process what came next. That's when the chaplain came. Chaplains within Space Marine chapters serve as both spiritual advisors and enforcers of doctrine, warriors whose duty is to safeguard the souls of their brothers, while also ensuring compliance with the chapter's rules and traditions. This chaplain, wearing the skull-faced helm that marked his office, had come to deliver news that would change everything. He explained that Titus had been cleared of all charges, that the Inquisition had acknowledged his purity, that he was free to return to the Ultramarines if he chose. But he also explained that much had changed during Titus's absence. The second company now had a new captain, Farthest Akaran, a younger warrior who had only recently left the scout company when Titus had been taken away. Titus's first instinct was to refuse, to return to the Death Watch and continue his service as Nullus. The Black Shield had been his penance, yet his way of serving without the burden of his past or his name. The idea of going back, of facing warriors who might still harbor suspicions about him, seemed impossible. But the chaplain would not accept this. He explained that if Titus truly sought redemption, if he truly wished to serve the Emperor with honor, then he must return to his chapter. He must face whatever doubts or suspicions remained, and prove through his service that he was worthy of wearing the Ultramarines' colors once more. The chaplain also delivered other news that struck Titus like a physical blow. Chapter Master Manius Calgar had spent years trying to get Titus released, had made countless requests and demands to the Inquisition, had never stopped searching for the captain who had vanished from Graia. The removal of Titus's name from the chapter's records had not been a disavowal, but a different kind of shame. The shame of having failed to protect one of their own from the Inquisition's excesses. The Ultramarines had not forgotten him. They had not abandoned him. They had been looking for him all along, and only Thrax's paranoid secrecy had prevented them from finding him. This revelation shattered the foundation of Titus's self-imposed exile. He had believed himself dishonored, unworthy, too much of a risk to be allowed back into the chapter. But that belief had been based on a misunderstanding, on ignorance of the truth. His chapter wanted him back. His chapter master had fought for him. His brothers had never stopped considering him one of their own. How could he refuse that? So Titus agreed. He would return to the Ultramarines. He would accept whatever rank they offered him, would serve in whatever capacity they deemed appropriate. He would prove that their faith in him was not misplaced, that he was still the warrior they remembered, still loyal, still dedicated, still willing to give everything in service to the Emperor. He was outfitted with new armor, the Mark Tex Tacticus power armor worn by Primaris Marines. The blue and white of the Ultramarines replaced the black of the Death Watch, and for the first time in over a century, Demetrian Titus wore his name and his chapter's colors openly. The chaplain gave him one final instruction. His past, his service as a Black Shield, his imprisonment by the Inquisition, all of this would be kept secret from the rank and file of the Second Company. He was to report to Captain Asheran and take up the rank of lieutenant, and second in command of the company he had once led. And he was not to speak of where he had been or what he had endured. Titus accepted these conditions. He understood the reasoning. The chapter needed to move forward, and constantly explaining his history would only create division and uncertainty. Better to let the past remain buried and focus on the future. When he finally met Captain Sevastus Acheran, Titus could see the younger warrior's reservations. Acheran was competent and dedicated, a worthy commander of the Second Company. But the sudden reappearance of his predecessor, now transformed into a Primaris Marine and assigned as his lieutenant, created an awkward situation. Acheran made his concerns known. He acknowledged Titus's past achievements, but also expressed uncertainty about how the rank and file would react to his return. Is about whether his presence might undermine the authority Acheran had worked to establish. Titus understood these concerns and made no attempt to challenge them. He accepted his new rank without complaint or resentment. He had been a captain once. Now he was a lieutenant. The specific title mattered less than the opportunity to serve, to be useful, to prove that he was still worthy of the trust his chapter had placed in him. He was assigned to lead a truncated squad, which eventually consisted of Sergeant Valorum Gadriel and Brother Majorus Chiron. Gadriel was ambitious and by the book, a warrior who had expected to be promoted to lieutenant before Titus's sudden reappearance had disrupted those plans. Chiron was more easygoing, a former member of the Unnumbered Sons. Those Primaris Marines created during the Indomitus Crusade, who had been distributed to various chapters to bolster their ranks. Neither Gadriel nor Chiron knew anything about Titus's history. They knew he had served in the Death Watch, knew he was being given this position by direct order of Chapter Master Calgar, but the details of his past remained hidden. This created tension, particularly with Gadriel, who resented having his expected promotion delayed by a warrior whose background was shrouded in mystery. But there was no time for lengthy integration or team-building exercises. The Fourth Tyrannic War was raging, and the Ultramarines' Second Company was deployed to the Residius system to help stem the tide of the Tyrannid invasion. The Residius campaign would test Titus in ways that no battle had tested him before, not because the enemy was stronger or the stakes higher than what he had faced, but because he was fighting with brothers who didn't know him, who had questions he couldn't answer, who watched him with a mixture of respect for his obvious skill and suspicion about his unexplained past. Gadriel, in particular, pressed him for information. Where had he served? Why was his past redacted? What had he done to earn Calgar's personal endorsement? Titus deflected these questions as best he could, citing chapter security and his orders to maintain silence. But he could see the frustration in Gadriel's eyes, the sense that his lieutenant was hiding something important. Despite this tension, Titus proved his worth on the battlefield. The tactical acumen that had made him an effective captain was still there. enhanced now by additional years of experience fighting Xenos threats as part of the Death Watch. He led his small squad with precision and effectiveness, adapting to the Tyranid threat with the same analytical approach he had once applied to studying enemy tactics. Captain Acheron, whatever his initial reservations, began to see the value of having Titus in his company. The lieutenant's combat effectiveness was undeniable, and his humble acceptance of his reduced rank set an example for the other warriors. Slowly, grudgingly, Acheron's concerns began to ease, but the Residius campaign was about to become far more complicated, because the Tyranids were not the only threat in the system. Waiting in the shadows, manipulating events for their own purposes, were servants of the chaos god Tzeentch, the changer of ways, or the master of schemes and sorcery. And at their head was a sorcerer lord named Imura, who had taken a special interest in Dimitri and Titus. The involvement of chaos forces should have been detected earlier, but the shadow in the warp that accompanied the Tyranids also interfered with the kind of psychic detection that might have warned of their presence. It was only when an Adeptus Mechanicus research team investigating something called Project Aurora was attacked that the truth became clear. Project Aurora was a mysterious piece of archaeotech, ancient technology from before the Age of Strife, that the Mechanicus had been studying in secret. Its exact nature remained classified, but it was powerful enough that both the Tyranids and the forces of chaos were willing to fight for control of it. Titus and his squad were assigned to rescue the Mechanicus personnel and secure whatever remained of the project before either enemy could claim it. What they found was a massacre. The Thousand Suns, those traitor space marines who served Tzeentch, had slaughtered the research team and were in the process of stealing the very technology the Ultramarines had come to protect. The presence of chaos forces in the Residius system transformed the nature of the campaign. It was no longer just a matter of holding back the Tyranid swarm. Now, the Ultramarines faced a multi-front war, fighting both the endless hunger of the hive mind and the twisted schemes of the ruinous powers. And it was during this campaign that something from Titus's past resurfaced in the most unexpected way. The Ultramarines needed to send an astropathic message to warn Marneus Calgar about the chaos presence and request additional support. When Titus and his squad reached the astropathic choir, the sanctioned psychers who enabled faster-than-light communication, one of the astropaths turned her blind eyes toward Titus and began to scream. She claimed he was a heretic, that he plotted to kill Chapter Master Calgar, that she could see the taint of chaos upon his soul. It was a setup, of course, another part of Imura's scheme to sow discord among the Ultramarines. But the accusation, coming from a sanctioned Imperial psyker, could not simply be dismissed. Gadriel and Chiron looked at their lieutenant with new suspicion, their questions about his mysterious past taking on a darker cast. Titus had faced many enemies in his long life, but this, the suspicion of his own brothers based on accusations he could not defend against without revealing his past, this was a unique kind of torture. He could see the doubt in their eyes, could feel the trust that he had been slowly building beginning to crumble. The situation resolved when Chaplain Quintus, the spiritual advisor assigned to the Second Company, intervened. The chaplain vouched for Titus, ordered the mission to continue, and personally oversaw the sending of the astropathic message. But the damage had been done. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and Titus knew they would not easily be removed. The campaign continued through multiple worlds in the Residius system. They fought Tyranids in the jungles and hive cities. They battled Thousand Sun sorcerers who wielded powers that could reshape reality. They recovered fragments of Project Aurora, piecing together the mystery of what exactly the Mechanicus had been working on and why both the Tyranids and Chaos wanted it so badly. And through it all, Titus felt the weight of history pressing down on him. Because this situation, fighting against Chaos while his loyalty was questioned by those around him, was eerily similar to what had happened on Graia over a century ago. Once again, his unusual resistance to Chaos was raising suspicions. Once again, he found himself unable to adequately explain or defend against those suspicions. The campaign reached its climax on the cemetery world of Imperium, where Imura had assembled his forces for a final attempt to claim the power of Project Aurora. Chapter Master Marnus Calgar himself arrived to lead the Ultramarines, as bringing with him reinforcements and the authority to coordinate a decisive strike against the Chaos forces. The battle was brutal. The Thousand Suns, with their rubric marines and powerful sorcerers, were formidable opponents. Imura himself was a being of terrible power, capable of summoning demons and wielding psychic energies that could tear through armor and flesh with terrifying ease. But the Ultramarines, led by Calgar, proved superior. They fought with discipline and coordination, adapting to the Chaos Force's tactics, pushing through the demonic summoning and sorcerous attacks with unwavering determination. Titus distinguished himself in this battle, leading his squad with the same tactical brilliance that had made him a successful captain. He confronted Thousand Suns sorcerers, protected his brothers from psychic attacks, and proved once again that whatever made him resistant to Chaos's corruption also made him valuable in fighting against it. When the battle was won, when Imura had been banished and his forces scattered, Captain Acheron personally sought out Titus. In front of the assembled Second Company, Acheron presented him with the laurels of victory, a decoration recognizing his exceptional service during the campaign. More importantly, Acheron spoke of how Titus's leadership and skill had been essential to their victory. He acknowledged that his earlier reservations about Titus had been unfounded, that the lieutenant had proven himself worthy of the Second Company's trust and respect. It should have been a moment of pure triumph. After so much loss and suffering, after a century of imprisonment and exile, Titus was finally being recognized and honored by his chapter once more. But then Chaplain Quintus approached him, and everything changed again. The chaplain congratulated Titus on his performance, acknowledging that he had proven himself worthy of rejoining the Ultramarines. But then Quintus issued a warning. The risk of chaos corruption was ever present, and if Titus were ever to truly falter, if he were ever to betray the Emperor, the chaplain would not hesitate to carry out his execution. And then, in a moment that must have hit Titus like a blow to the chest, Chaplain Quintus removed his skull helm. Underneath was the face of Brother Leandros. The young warrior who had reported Titus to the Inquisition a century ago had risen through the ranks in the intervening years. He had joined the Reclusium, had become a chaplain. He had been assigned to the very same Second Company that Titus had once commanded. And now he stood before his former captain, older, but still recognizable, still watchful, still suspicious. This revelation cast the entire Residius campaign in a new light. Leandros had been watching Titus from the beginning, had been the one vouching for him to the rest of the company, while simultaneously maintaining his vigilance for any sign of corruption. The mission to Zahuj that would come later, the accusations of the astropath, all of it had been orchestrated or influenced by Leandros as a test of Titus's loyalty. The two warriors looked at each other across a gulf of time and experience that had transformed them both. Leandros was no longer the young, the idealistic brother who had believed that following the Codex to the letter was the path to righteousness. A century as a chaplain had taught him the complexities of faith and duty, had shown him that the universe was more complicated than he had once believed. But he had not changed in one crucial respect. He still believed that Titus was a potential threat, still believed that the unusual immunity to chaos that Titus displayed required eternal vigilance. He had recommended Titus for the Second Company, yes, and had vouched for him with Captain Acheron, yes, but only so that he could personally watch Titus, could be there to execute him if the corruption that Leandros believed must exist finally revealed itself. Titus understood this. He understood that Leandros' support came with conditions, but that his service in the Second Company would forever be shadowed by the suspicion of the very warrior who had reported him a century ago. But he also understood that this was simply another challenge to endure, another burden to carry. He had survived torture. He had survived exile. He had survived the Rubicon Primaris. He could survive being watched by someone who doubted his loyalty, as long as he could continue serving the Emperor and the Imperium. And perhaps, in time, he could prove to Leandros what he had been unable to prove a century ago. That loyalty was measured not in adherence to rules, but in the choices made when the rules provided no clear answer. Following the Residius campaign, Titus was assigned to a new mission, one that would test him in ways that no battle had before. As the mission to Zahuj was classified as having projected mortality absolute, which meant that those assigned to it were not expected to survive. It was, in essence, a suicide mission. The objective was straightforward enough: locate and destroy a chaos relic, a petrified statue of a Lord of Change, one of the greater demons of Tzeentch. The relic was exerting a corrupting influence over the entire world, and the only way to stop it was to destroy it and provide targeting coordinates for orbital bombardment that would eliminate both the relic and the chaos cult that worshipped it. Titus was assigned to lead this mission, and with him went 3 others: Blade Guard veterans, Icaron and Levantus, warriors of skill and experience, and Sergeant Matorus, the same warrior who had found Titus as a child on Tarentus over 2 centuries ago, or who had recognized in that small boy carrying an oversized knife a soul that had never known fear. The reunion between Titus and Matorus should have been a joyful one. Here were warriors who had not seen each other in centuries, who had both survived the endless wars of the Imperium through skill and fortune. But there was a weight to it, a sense of sadness that both warriors felt, but neither fully expressed. Because Matorus knew about Titus's imprisonment. He knew about the century of torture, about the suspicions that had followed Titus throughout his career. And he wondered, as he had wondered when he first found that fearless child, whether recruiting Titus had been a blessing or a curse for the chapter. The mission began, as such missions always did: drop pod insertion, rapid deployment to the target area, fighting through enemy forces to reach the objective. But the world of Zahuj was saturated with warp energy, the presence of the demon statue warping reality in subtle and not so subtle ways. When they reached the statue and prepared to destroy it, when they opened fire on the towering figure of the petrified Lord of Change, they were attacked by the High Priestess of the Tzeentchian cult. She was a chaos sorcerer of terrible power, capable of manipulating time itself, of freezing her enemies in place while she attacked them with psychic assaults designed to exploit their deepest fears. Icaron fell first, his fear of his own weakness manifesting as his armor turned against him, crushing the flesh it was meant to protect. Levantus followed, killed by something unseen, some terror that only he could perceive, while then the sorcerer turned her attention to Matorus, and in his mind, she showed him his greatest fear. It was a vision of Titus, but not as he was now. In this vision, Titus wore the corrupted armor of a Chaos Space Marine, and in this vision, Chaos Titus attacked Matorus, stabbing him with a combat knife, just as the child Matorus had found on Tarentus had carried one all those years ago. The vision was powerful enough to wound Matorus severely, leaving him collapsed and bleeding, unable to defend himself or aid his brothers. The sorcerer's triumph seemed complete. She had broken the defenses of the Ultramarines through the simple expedient of making them face what they feared most. But then she turned to Titus and discovered something that shattered her confidence and ultimately cost her life. Titus had no fear, not of death, but not of failure, not of corruption. When the sorcerer attempted to enter his mind, to find the fear she could exploit to kill him as she had killed the others, she found nothing. A void where fear should have been. An absolute absence of the very emotion she needed to fuel her attack. In that moment of confusion, Titus broke free of her paralysis. He charged forward, his combat knife in hand, and shattered the sorcerer's force staff, the tool through which she channeled her power. As she attempted to flee, wings of psychic energy carrying her away, Titus pursued. A single strike of his blade severed her in two, ending her life and breaking the temporal prison she had created. Time resumed its normal flow. The bolter rounds that had been frozen mid-flight completed their trajectories, and destroying the demon statue and creating the beacon that the orbiting Ultramarine's warship needed to target its bombardment. Titus carried the wounded Matoris back to the extraction point, fighting through hordes of cultists that poured from every direction, their sanctuary destroyed and their goddess slain. The orbital bombardment began as they reached safety, purifying fire consuming the world's corruption, burning away the taint that had poisoned it. They had survived, against all expectations, against the projected mortality absolute that had marked this mission. They had survived and succeeded. But as Matoris recovered from his wounds, as he reflected on what he had witnessed, he found himself troubled. The child he had recruited, that fearless soul he had worried about, it had saved his life through that very same absence of fear. The trait that had made Matoris wonder if he was making a mistake had proven to be Titus's greatest strength. And yet, the question remained, what could a soul like that be capable of? What was the ultimate destiny of a warrior who possessed such perfect immunity to Chaos's most insidious weapons? These questions would have to wait for answers, because the galaxy had more immediate demands on Titus's service. News reached the Ultramarines of a tragedy on the hive world of Trig. A Genestealer cult, those insidious Xenos hybrids who infiltrated human society and prepared worlds for consumption by the Tyranids, had been discovered in the planet's primary hive. Captain Sevastus Acheron had led a strike force to investigate and contain the threat. But containment had proven impossible. The cult was too widespread, too deeply entrenched. In a decision that demonstrated both tactical acumen and absolute dedication to duty, Acheron had activated the hive's anti-atomic lockdown protocols, sealing himself and his entire force inside with the cultists. It was a death sentence, but it was also the only way to prevent the cult from spreading to the rest of the planet. Every space marine who had landed on Trig died in the weeks that followed. Acheron, Chiron, and every other brother who had accompanied them sold their lives to cull untold numbers of Xenos hybrids to buy time for Imperial reinforcements to arrive and finish the purge. When those reinforcements finally broke through the lockdown, they found a tomb. The bodies of loyal space marines lay among the corpses of thousands of cultists, evidence of a desperate last stand that had saved an entire world from Tyranid invasion. For Titus, the news struck with particular force. Acheron had been his captain, the warrior who had given him a chance when many would have refused. Chiron had been his battle brother, someone he had fought alongside during the Residius campaign. Both were gone now. Their gene seed recovered, but their service ended. The second company needed a new captain, and Chapter Master Marneus Calgar, in recognition of Titus's exemplary service since his return and his previous excellence as a company commander, made his decision. Demetrian Titus would once again become captain of the Ultramarines' second company. Yet this promotion came with more than just a return to his former rank. Calgar also named Titus as Master of the Watch, making him responsible for the defense of Macraga and the fortress of Hera. And more than that, Calgar assigned him a duty that seemed impossible: to oversee the expansion of Ultramar back to its former size of 500 worlds, as Primarch Robute Guilliman had ordered. Guilliman himself had returned, awakened from his millennia-long stasis, and was reshaping the Imperium according to his vision. Part of that vision was the restoration of Ultramar to its pre-heresy glory, transforming it into a bastion of order and strength in a galaxy gone mad. This was a task that would have challenged the greatest commanders. Titus accepted it with the same quiet determination he had shown in accepting every other burden placed upon him. He was also given the authority to assemble a unique command squad, one that mixed both Astartes and mortal advisors. The Wardens of Ultramar, as this group came to be known, included warriors like Sergeant Matoris and Ancient Gadriel, who had proven themselves during the Residius campaign. but it also included mortal humans, fleet officers, military commanders, diplomats, astropaths, people whose skills and knowledge could help Titus fulfill the enormous responsibility he had been given. With this command squad at his side, Titus set about his work. The Ultramarine Reclamation, as it came to be known, was a campaign unlike any he had fought before. It required not just military victory, but diplomacy, their coordination with multiple imperial agencies, and the kind of strategic thinking that operated on a scale of sectors rather than battlefields. And through it all, Titus carried the weight of his past. He was once again captain of the Second Company, a position he had lost a century ago through no fault of his own. He had been tested in ways that few warriors ever experienced, had endured trials that would have broken lesser souls. He had been betrayed, imprisoned, tortured, exiled, and reborn. But he had never wavered. He had never turned from his duty. He had never stopped being loyal to the Emperor and the Imperium, even when the Imperium itself had seemed to abandon him. This is what makes Demetrian Titus the most loyal Ultramarine in Warhammer 40,000. Not his achievements in battle, though those are impressive. Not his tactical genius or his leadership abilities, though both are exceptional. But his absolute, unshakable loyalty in the face of every trial the galaxy could throw at him. Most warriors break when betrayed by those they trust. Titus endured. Most warriors lose themselves during a century of imprisonment and torture. Titus remained who he was. Most warriors would have turned bitter or sought revenge against those who wronged them. Titus simply continued serving. He is loyal not because it is easy, but because it is who he is. Loyalty, for Titus, is not a choice or a strategy or something to be abandoned when circumstances change. It is the fundamental core of his being, as essential to him as breathing. And yet, the mystery remains. Why is he immune to chaos? What is the source of this resistance that has caused so much suspicion and saved so many lives? Various theories exist. Some suggest it is a unique mutation in his gene seed, a 1 in a trillion fluke that grants him protection from the warp. Others speculate that he might possess a connection, however faint, to the Emperor's own anti-warp nature, that he might carry within him some echo of the anathema that the forces of chaos fear above all things. Still others wonder if it is simply a matter of character, that his complete absence of fear, that trait Matorus recognized in him as a child, provides natural immunity to chaos's primary weapons. Because chaos feeds on emotion, on fear and anger and despair. A soul that genuinely knows no fear, that approaches every horror with the same calm determination. He might be naturally resistant to corruption, not through any special power, but simply through the absence of the vulnerabilities chaos exploits. The truth is unknown. Perhaps even Titus himself doesn't understand the source of his immunity. What matters is that he has it, and that he uses it in service to the Emperor rather than allowing it to be turned against the Imperium. But this mystery makes him a marked man. The Inquisition, particularly the Ordo Malleus, views him as either an invaluable weapon or an unacceptable risk. There are inquisitors who would love to study him, to understand the source of his resistance and perhaps replicate it in others. And there are inquisitors who see him as a threat too great to be allowed to exist, who believe that anything that defies the normal rules of the warp must be destroyed as a matter of precaution. And within his own chapter, Leandros continues to watch. The chaplain, who was once the young brother captain, has risen to a position where he can observe Titus closely, where he can be ready to act if the corruption he believes must exist finally reveals itself. Their relationship is complicated, built on a foundation of shared history and mutual distrust that may never fully heal. Yet Titus continues his work. As this account is written, he is leading the Ultramarine Reclamation, working to restore Guilliman's realm to its ancient glory. He fights against Necrons who seek to resurrect terrible powers from the war in heaven. And he coordinates with other Ultramarines captains, and mortal commanders to secure worlds that have been in enemy hands for generations. And he does so knowing that he is being watched, that his every action is scrutinized for signs of corruption, that any mistake or anomaly could bring the Inquisition down upon him once more. But this doesn't slow him, doesn't make him hesitate or second-guess his decisions, because Demetrian Titus has learned something that few in the Imperium truly understand. Loyalty is not about being trusted, it is about being trustworthy. It is about doing the right thing, regardless of whether anyone believes you, regardless of what consequences might follow, regardless of how difficult or thankless the task might be. Titus serves not because he expects recognition or reward. He serves because it is his duty. It's because the Emperor and the Imperium need warriors willing to give everything without asking for anything in return. Because that is what it means to be a Space Marine, what it means to be an Ultramarine, what it means to be the kind of man that Titus has always been. In a galaxy where corruption is easy and temptation is everywhere, where even the most loyal can fall and the most powerful can be turned, Demetrian Titus stands as proof that loyalty is possible, that a warrior can endure a century of torture and emerge uncorrupted, that betrayal by brothers can be faced with forgiveness rather than bitterness, that duty can be sustained even when no one is watching, even when there is no glory to be gained, even when the cost is everything. This is what makes Demetrian Titus the most loyal Ultramarine in the history of the chapter. Perhaps in the history of the Imperium itself. The current era of the Imperium is one of unprecedented change. Primarch Reboot Guilliman has returned from his millennia-long stasis, awakened to find an Imperium far different from the one he helped build. The Great Rift has torn the galaxy in two, separating entire sectors from the light of the Astronomicon. The forces of chaos push harder than they have in 10,000 years. The Tyranids devour world after world in their insatiable hunger. The Necrons awaken from their ancient slumber with technologies that dwarf anything humanity possesses. In this age of darkness, the Imperium needs heroes. It needs warriors who can stand against impossible odds and refuse to break. It needs leaders who can inspire others to greatness, even when hope seems lost. Yes, it needs men and women of unshakable loyalty who will serve the Emperor's vision even when the Emperor himself cannot guide them. Demetrian Titus is exactly such a warrior. But what makes his loyalty so remarkable is not that it has never been tested. Rather, it is that it has been tested more severely than most could endure, and it has never been found wanting. Consider what he has faced. He has survived direct exposure to the warp on multiple occasions, emerging each time without corruption or taint. This alone would mark him as exceptional, as someone touched by either divine providence or something far more sinister. But the response to this gift, if gift it is, has been suspicion and persecution rather than celebration. He has been betrayed by a brother he fought beside, or reported to the Inquisition by someone he had trained and protected. For many warriors, such betrayal would breed bitterness and resentment, would create a wound that never truly heals. But Titus understood Leandros's reasoning, even if he disagreed with it. He recognized that his young brother had been acting according to his understanding of duty, had been trying to protect the chapter, even if his methods were flawed. This capacity for understanding, for seeing the perspective of those who wrong him, is rare in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. Most Space Marines are trained to view the world in absolutes, to see enemies and allies with no room for nuance in between. But Titus, perhaps because of his analytical approach to warfare, perhaps because of some fundamental aspect of his character, maintains the ability to understand motivations even when he finds the resulting actions unacceptable. He endured a century of imprisonment and torture at the hands of Inquisitor Thrax, a century during which he was subjected to psychic probing, physical torment, and the slow erosion of hope that comes from being forgotten by those you served. Many warriors would have emerged from such an experience broken, their minds shattered, their loyalty compromised by rage at the injustice they suffered. But Titus emerged as he entered, loyal, dedicated, and ready to serve. He bore no grudge against the Inquisition as an institution, understanding that Thrax's actions were those of a corrupted individual rather than the organization as a whole. He held no resentment toward the Ultramarines for failing to secure his release, or because he understood the limits of what even a chapter master could do when confronting the Inquisition's authority. This capacity to endure suffering without allowing it to corrupt his purpose is perhaps the most impressive aspect of Titus's character. In a universe where chaos feeds on negative emotions, where pain and anger and despair are the very tools that the ruinous powers use to corrupt the loyal, Titus's ability to suffer without being twisted by that suffering is nothing short of miraculous. When he was freed, when he discovered that he had been removed from the Ultramarines' records, Titus believed himself dishonored. Rather than raging against this perceived rejection, rather than demanding answers or forcing a confrontation, he quietly accepted what he thought was his fate. He joined the Death Watch as a black shield, as erasing his own identity, giving up his name and his history to serve in anonymity. This act demonstrates a humility that is extraordinarily rare among Space Marines. These warriors are, by design, the greatest fighters humanity can produce. They are genetically enhanced, psychologically conditioned, and extensively trained to be superior to normal humans in every measurable way. This superiority, necessary as it is for their role as the Imperium's defenders, can easily breed arrogance. Many Space Marines develop an inflated sense of their own importance, believing that their achievements entitle them to recognition and respect. Titus never fell into this trap. Despite his accomplishments, despite his proven abilities as both a warrior and a leader, he was content to serve as a nameless black shield, out to fight and potentially die without anyone ever knowing who he had been or what he had achieved. This is the behavior not of someone seeking glory or recognition, but of someone who genuinely believes that service itself is the only reward worth having. And when he was finally returned to the Ultramarines, when he learned that his chapter had never forgotten him, that Calgar had fought for years to secure his release, Titus did not demand his old rank or position. He accepted demotion from captain to lieutenant without complaint. He served under a warrior who had been a scout when Titus was taken, never expressing resentment or attempting to undermine a Charon's authority. This willingness to set aside ego, to accept a reduced role for the good of the chapter, but demonstrates a maturity and selflessness that even many veteran Space Marines never achieve. Titus understood that the chapter's needs were more important than his personal pride, that serving effectively in a lesser role was preferable to creating discord by demanding the restoration of his former position. Throughout the Residius campaign, Titus faced suspicion from his new squadmates. Gadriel questioned him constantly, frustrated by the mysteries surrounding his past. The Astropath's accusations of heresy created doubt in the minds of those who fought beside him. And shadowing it all was the presence of Leandros, now a chaplain, watching for any sign that his old suspicions had been justified. A lesser warrior might have become defensive, might have grown angry at the constant questioning and suspicion. But Titus remained patient. He understood that trust must be earned, that his squadmates had every right to wonder about someone whose past was shrouded in secrecy. He proved himself through his actions, demonstrating his loyalty not through words, but through consistent, reliable service. This pattern of responding to suspicion and persecution with patient dedication rather than anger or resentment defines Titus's entire story. Every trial he faces, he meets with the same quiet determination. Every setback, he absorbs and moves past. Every betrayal or injustice, he endures without allowing it to compromise his loyalty or his effectiveness. But what is the source of this extraordinary loyalty? What allows Titus to endure what would break others? Part of the answer lies in his unique nature, that mysterious immunity to chaos that has caused so much suspicion. When the Chaos Sorcerer on attempted to kill him by exploiting his fears, she found nothing to exploit. Titus possesses a complete absence of fear, not because he has conquered fear through training or willpower, but because fear simply does not exist within him. This absence of fear has profound implications. Fear is one of the primary tools that chaos uses to corrupt and control. Fear of death, fear of failure, fear of damnation. These fears can be twisted and exploited, used to drive wedges between brothers, to sow doubt and despair. But a warrior who genuinely knows no fear cannot be manipulated in these ways. Maturus recognized this quality in Titus when he was still a child, and it troubled him. A child without fear could become a monster. He's someone who pushed beyond all reasonable limits because they lacked the natural warning systems that keep others alive. But Titus never became that monster. Instead, his fearlessness was tempered by something else, a profound sense of duty. Where fear might normally guide a warrior's actions, teaching caution and prudence, Titus relies on his understanding of duty. He evaluates situations not based on whether they frighten him, because nothing frightens him, but based on what needs to be done to fulfill his responsibilities. This creates a different kind of moral compass, one oriented entirely around service and obligation, rather than self-preservation. This orientation explains much of Titus's behavior. When faced with the choice to resist the Inquisition or to surrender, he surrendered because resisting would have harmed the chapter. Or when offered the chance to return to the Ultramarines after his release, he declined because he believed his presence would bring dishonor. When finally convinced to return, he accepted demotion because the chapter's stability was more important than his pride. In every case, Titus's decisions are guided by a calculation of what will best serve the Emperor and the Imperium. His own welfare, his own desires, his own sense of justice. All of these are secondary to the needs of the greater whole. This is what true loyalty looks like, stripped of all selfishness and personal consideration. But there is another aspect to Titus's loyalty that often goes unremarked. He is loyal not just to the Imperium as an abstract concept, but to the people within it. He works effectively with Lieutenant Mira during the Graia campaign, treating her as a valued ally rather than a mere mortal to be dismissed. He mourns the loss of Sidonus as a friend, not just as a fallen brother in arms. He feels the weight of responsibility for every warrior under his command, understanding that their lives are precious and not to be wasted. This human element to Titus's loyalty prevents it from becoming the cold, mechanical dedication that characterizes some of the Imperium's servants. He serves not because he has been programmed to serve, but because he genuinely believes in the value of what he is protecting. The people of the Imperium, flawed and limited as they are worth defending. The brothers who fight beside him, suspicious though some may be, are worth protecting. The ideals that the Imperium claims to represent, even when it falls short of them, are worth pursuing. As this combination of absolute fearlessness and genuine care for others creates a unique form of loyalty, Titus cannot be frightened into submission or corrupted through despair. But neither is he a mindless automaton, following orders without thought or feeling. He is, in the truest sense, a warrior who serves because he chooses to serve, who remains loyal because loyalty is the foundation of his identity. The implications of Titus's nature for the Imperium are profound. If his immunity to chaos could be understood and replicated, it could revolutionize the fight against the ruinous powers. Imagine squads of space marines who could operate in environments saturated with warp energy without fear of corruption. Consider the tactical advantages of warriors who could face demons and sorcerers without psychological vulnerability. This is why the Inquisition finds Titus so fascinating and so threatening. He represents either an incredible opportunity or an existential threat, and determining which requires understanding something that may be fundamentally unknowable. How do you study someone who defies the basic rules of how the warp interacts with mortal souls? How do you determine if his immunity is a blessing or a curse when conventional methods of detection reveal nothing? These questions ensure that Titus will never be free from scrutiny. Leandros, now in a position to watch him closely, represents the institutional suspicion that will follow Titus for the rest of his life. Every action will be examined for signs of corruption. Every decision will be questioned. Every anomaly will be investigated. This is the price Titus pays for being different, or for possessing an ability that the Imperium desperately wants to understand but cannot. Yet Titus accepts this burden as he accepts all others. He understands that suspicion is natural, even reasonable, given what he represents. He does not resent Leandros for watching him, because he understands that such vigilance is part of a chaplain's duty. He does not rage against the unfairness of being constantly suspected, despite never giving any actual evidence of corruption. He simply continues to serve, knowing that his actions will speak louder than any words he could offer in his own defense. This acceptance of unjust treatment without becoming bitter is perhaps the most powerful testament to Titus's character. In a galaxy where injustice is commonplace, where the innocent suffer alongside the guilty, and where loyalty is often rewarded with suspicion and service with sacrifice, Titus maintains his dedication not because he expects fairness, but because he has committed himself to a purpose larger than personal satisfaction. The story of Dimitri and Titus is still being written. As this account concludes, he leads the Ultramarine reclamation, working to restore Guilliman's realm while fighting against enemies on multiple fronts. The challenges he faces are immense. The Necrons of Nova Magnor, led by what may be the first destroyer ever created, seek to resurrect powers that could threaten the entire sector. Other threats, known and unknown, press against Ultramar's borders. Titus faces these challenges with the same qualities that have defined his entire career: tactical brilliance, personal courage, humble service, and absolute loyalty. He leads the Wardens of Ultramar, that unique command squad mixing Astartes and mortals, with a style that emphasizes cooperation and mutual respect. He coordinates with other commanders across the sector, building the networks of alliance and support that Ultramar will need to survive the challenges ahead. And through it all, he carries the knowledge that he is being watched, that his every action is subject to scrutiny, that any mistake could be interpreted as evidence of the corruption that some believe must inevitably manifest. This would paralyze many warriors, would make them hesitant and second-guess every decision. But Titus has learned to live with suspicion as a constant companion. It does not slow him or make him cautious beyond what tactical wisdom demands. It is simply another factor to be considered, as another burden to be carried, another price to be paid for the privilege of serving. If there is a lesson to be drawn from Titus's story, it is this: loyalty is not proven by never being tested, but by how one responds when tested. It is easy to remain loyal when you are trusted, when your service is appreciated, when your sacrifices are recognized and rewarded. True loyalty reveals itself when you are suspected despite being innocent, when you are punished despite being faithful, when you are forced to serve without recognition or reward. Dimitri and Titus has been tested in every way that the galaxy can test a warrior's loyalty. He has been betrayed by brothers, imprisoned by the Inquisition, subjected to torture and isolation, erased from the records of the chapter he served, forced to fight in anonymity, and constantly watched for signs of corruption that do not exist. Through all of this, his loyalty never wavered. He never turned to chaos, never sought revenge against those who wronged him, never abandoned his duty even when duty demanded everything and gave nothing in return. This is what makes him the most loyal Ultramarine. Not that he has never faced temptation, but that he has faced every temptation the galaxy could offer and has never yielded. Not that he is perfect, but that his imperfections have never compromised his fundamental dedication. Not that he is without doubt or struggle, but that his doubts and struggles have never prevented him from doing what needed to be done. In the character of Dimitri and Titus, we see loyalty distilled to its purest essence. Loyalty not as a sentiment or a slogan, but as a lived reality. A loyalty not as a reward for trust, but as a gift given freely even to those who doubt. Loyalty not as a contract with terms and conditions, but as an identity so fundamental that it cannot be separated from the person who embodies it. The Imperium of man is built on the sacrifices of countless billions, warriors and civilians alike, who give their lives in service to an empire that barely knows they exist. Most serve for a time and then fade into obscurity, their contributions noted, if at all, only as statistics in some vast ledger. A few become legends, their names remembered across millennia, their deeds celebrated in songs and stories. Demetrian Titus occupies a space between these extremes. He is known within the Ultramarines, respected by those who understand what he has endured and achieved. But he is not seeking fame or recognition beyond his chapter. He serves not for glory, but because service is who he is. His loyalty is not performative, not designed to impress or inspire, but genuine and self-sustaining. This authentic, unshakable loyalty is exactly what the Imperium needs in this dark age. Not warriors who serve because they expect reward or fear punishment, but warriors who serve because they have chosen to serve, and no amount of hardship or injustice will change that choice. Not leaders who demand trust, but never earn it, but leaders whose every action demonstrates their trustworthiness, even to those who refuse to see it. Not heroes who shine brightly for a moment and then fade, but steadfast servants who endure decade after decade, century after century, never wavering in their dedication. As the galaxy slides deeper into darkness, as the forces arrayed against humanity grow stronger and more numerous, the example of Demetrian Titus becomes increasingly important. He proves that loyalty is possible, even in the face of betrayal. That dedication can survive even a century of torture. That service can continue even when recognition is denied. That duty can be fulfilled even when it costs everything and gives nothing in return. These lessons are vital for an Imperium that often struggles to inspire genuine loyalty, that too often relies on fear and indoctrination rather than earning the dedication of its servants. Titus shows a different path, one where loyalty is not demanded or enforced, but chosen and maintained through the warrior's own will. Whether this path can be followed by others remains to be seen. Titus is unique in many ways. His immunity to chaos and absence of fear marking him as exceptional. But the core of his loyalty, that choice to serve regardless of cost or consequence, is something that any warrior can aspire to. It requires no special powers or genetic gifts, only the will to commit to something larger than oneself, and the strength to maintain that commitment through every trial. For those who look to the Ultramarines as exemplars of what Space Marines should be, Demetrian Titus provides a powerful model. He embodies the chapter's values of discipline, tactical excellence, and humble service, while also demonstrating a flexibility and adaptability that pure adherence to the Codex Astartes sometimes lacks. He proves that loyalty to the Codex's spirit is more important than blind obedience to its letter, a lesson that Leandros is still learning, even after a century as a chaplain. For those who look to Space Marines as humanity's greatest defenders, Titus demonstrates what these warriors can achieve when they combine their superhuman abilities with wisdom, humility, and genuine care for those they protect. He is not a mindless killing machine or an arrogant demigod, but a thoughtful leader who understands that his purpose is service, not domination. And for those who question whether loyalty is possible in a galaxy as cruel and unjust as the 41st Millennium, Titus provides a definitive answer. Yes, loyalty is possible. Even in the darkest circumstances, even when betrayed and persecuted, even when every reasonable person would understand and forgive bitterness or resentment, loyalty can endure. It is difficult. It requires strength of character that few possess. But it is possible, and Titus proves it with every action, every decision, every day of his long service. The future that awaits Demetrian Titus is uncertain. He may fall in battle against the Necrons of Nova Magnor or some other terrible enemy. He may be recalled to face new accusations from the Inquisition, new investigations into his mysterious immunity. He may rise to even greater positions of authority within the Ultramarines, or remain as captain of the Second Company for centuries to come. Whatever happens, one thing is certain. He will face it with the same unwavering loyalty that has defined his entire existence. He will serve the Emperor and the Imperium to the absolute limit of his abilities. He will lead his brothers with wisdom and courage. Yet he will protect the innocent and destroy the enemies of mankind. He will do all of this not because he expects reward or fears punishment, but because it is who he is, and nothing in this galaxy or beyond it can change that fundamental truth. In the end, that is the true measure of loyalty. Not what you do when it is easy or profitable, but what you do when it costs everything. Not how you act when you are trusted, but how you act when you are suspected. Not whether you serve when service is pleasant, but whether you serve when service demands sacrifice after sacrifice with no end in sight. By this measure, by any measure, Demetrian Titus stands as the most loyal Ultramarine who has ever lived. His loyalty has been tested in ways that would destroy lesser warriors, and it has never been found wanting. As he has endured a century of darkness and emerged into the light without compromise or corruption. He has been betrayed by brothers and has responded with understanding rather than vengeance. He has sacrificed everything, even his name and identity, in service to the Imperium. This is the legacy of Demetrian Titus, not his tactical victories, though they are impressive, not his survival of impossible odds, though that is remarkable, but his absolute, unshakable, incorruptible loyalty in the face of every trial the galaxy could devise. He is proof that even in the grim darkness of the far future, even when there is only war, loyalty remains possible. Difficult, costly, thankless loyalty that demands everything and gives nothing except the satisfaction of duty fulfilled. And in that proof lies hope. Yet because if one warrior can maintain such loyalty through such trials, then perhaps others can as well. Perhaps the Imperium need not rely solely on fear and indoctrination to secure the dedication of its servants. Perhaps there is another way, one exemplified by warriors like Titus who serve not because they must, but because they choose to, who remain loyal, not despite hardship, but in defiant rejection of everything that would compromise that loyalty. This is the gift that Demetrian Titus offers to the Imperium and to all who serve it. Not just his tactical skill or his mysterious immunity to chaos, valuable though both are, but his example, his proof that loyalty can survive and even flourish in circumstances that would destroy it in lesser souls. He is a beacon in the darkness, a demonstration that the human spirit, enhanced and tempered by the process of becoming a space marine, can achieve levels of dedication that seem almost impossible. So remember the name Demetrian Titus. Remember the captain who became a prisoner, the prisoner who became a black shield, the black shield who became a lieutenant, and the lieutenant who became a captain once more. Remember the warrior who never wavered, never broke, never surrendered his loyalty even when loyalty seemed to demand the impossible. Remember the most loyal Ultramarine, the man who proved that in the grim darkness of the far future, when there is only war, loyalty is not just a word, but a lived reality that can sustain warriors through any trial. His story continues even now, as he leads the Wardens of Ultramar in their campaign to restore Guilliman's realm. Every day brings new battles, with new challenges, new opportunities to demonstrate the loyalty that defines him. And every day, Titus meets those challenges with the same quiet determination, the same humble service, the same absolute dedication that has characterized his entire career. The galaxy will continue to test him. The Inquisition will continue to watch him. Enemies will continue to seek his destruction. Chaos will continue to try to corrupt him. None of it will matter, because Demetrian Titus has made his choice, and that choice is irrevocable. He will serve the Emperor and the Imperium until death finally claims him, and he will do so with a loyalty so pure and unshakable that even the ruinous powers themselves cannot tarnish it. This is the story of the most loyal Ultramarine in Warhammer 40,000. May his example inspire all who serve, all who struggle, us all who fight against the darkness. May his loyalty remind us that even in the cruelest galaxy, even in the most unjust circumstances, dedication to a greater purpose remains possible. And may his name be remembered not just for his victories in battle, but for the far greater victory of maintaining his loyalty through trials that would have broken anyone else. In service to the Emperor, in defense of humanity, in fulfillment of duty without end. This is Demetrian Titus. This is loyalty incarnate. This is what it means to be truly faithful in an age of betrayal. Remember him, honor him, and if you serve the Imperium in any capacity, strive to emulate even a fraction of the loyalty he has demonstrated across nearly 3 centuries of service. For the Emperor, for Ultramar, care for duty and honor, and the unwavering commitment to serve no matter the cost. This is the way of Demetrian Titus, the most loyal Ultramarine, and it is a way worth following into whatever darkness the future may hold. If you enjoyed learning about the incredible loyalty of Captain Demetrian Titus, please like this video and subscribe to Q on 40,000 for more deep dives into the lore of Warhammer 40,000. The galaxy is vast, and there are countless stories of heroism, sacrifice, and dedication waiting to be told. Join me as we explore them together, one tale at a time, discovering the warriors and leaders who shape the Imperium's endless war for survival. Until next time, may the Emperor protect you.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.